the the president of or CEO of Hoplite, and you want to go ahead and introduce yourself as well and say a little bit about yourself. Tell us your
So,
name. Always use AJC.
good. Well, apologies. My name is Anthony Kokenauer. I'm founder and president of Hoplite Industries. We're based here in Bozeman, Montana, and we partner at various levels with Montana State University with capstone projects. Very active intern participant for computer science, computer engineering, electrical engineering students at all levels, from freshmen and beyond on up through the grad program when and where we can. And appreciate the opportunity to join you today. I apologize we're a little bit shorter on time than I had originally hoped, but with some recent events that we've actually seen at Hoplite, I wanted to take an opportunity to provide a bit of an industry perspective. And certainly if we have questions along the way, I would love this to be a conversation. But I wanted to first start the industry perspective piece of what I'd like to discuss today around software bills of materials. And I actually want to marry this up to the hardware world that we so critically depend upon. From a compliance perspective, what we see, the alphabet soup that we deal with across the industry when it comes to boxes that we have to check, be it for cyber insurance, DoD cyber compliance, and even now TSA dealing with pipelines, energy pipelines, things of that nature. Increasingly, we are pressed to be able to provide and substantiate what goes into the products and services that we're developing. Academically, of course, citations and citing prior work, prior art, if we're dealing with patents and intellectual property, all absolutely critical to be considerate of and transparent with what it is we're using, what we're referencing, and how we're arriving at the results that we're ultimately sharing and or publishing, eventually selling at a certain point. All of that, I think, as an audience such as this is likely aware, I think started to take on a new perspective when we had the SolarWinds incident. What's now several years ago, where we had a relatively trivial vulnerability exposure, really, that allowed injection of third-party software, malicious software, that ultimately led to what was fairly catastrophic set of global events. That while the umbrella event that precipitated everything was certainly significant, the impact was felt here at home at individual organizations. A number of organizations, unfortunately, even here in Montana, were not only confirmed to be vulnerable, but actually accessed, had data exposed and accessed by unauthorized third parties. And I think for an audience such as this, not a surprise that provenance of software and this increased presence of open source software in being packaged in and leveraged, I think, for, in many cases, very good purposes into commercial software, that being packaged up, but at the same time being marginalized, not being given the same level of attention that we give our own first-party software. Because it's there, we understand the capabilities, we're able to plug it in, not unlike a Lego brick, and make it such that we can kind of stand on the shoulders of other people's work for good reason, of course, hopefully always honoring software licenses when and where necessary. But having that those open source pieces marginalized is not something that is inherent just to software that we interact with on a daily basis, often via browser or mobile device, what have you, but increasingly being built into critical infrastructure. And this is where we'll start to transition into some of the other things that Hoplite has, maybe not a unique perspective on, but definitely a rare perspective on, and seeing software, application layer software, OS and distributions, firmware, in some cases microcode, being infiltrated in ways that is often precipitated by carelessness, again, marginalizing some of the things that we've come to take for granted across the software industry. But if you imagine, for example, an integrated piece of equipment such as an internet firewall or router, even the internet switch, data that device that simply is there to move data around. And because it's in an IT closet or in a data center or in a telecom facility, out of sight, out of mind, we're of course not thinking about what's in there. As compared to just 10 years ago, we see devices from the likes, and this is not to pick on any one manufacturer, but to raise an example, as compared to 10 years ago, organizations like Cisco Systems and Juniper and many others have a much, much higher percentage of presence of open source software, which is fantastic from an economic perspective and allows those organizations to move faster and to do more and to be more efficient. And to gain collective benefit of innovation across the world by way of the internet. Unfortunately, though, if you imagine the complexity of dealing with a SolarWinds type of situation where we have a combination of server-based and some user-facing applications that in the grand scheme are relatively easy to patch. I think we can all, with the endpoint, even the endpoint that I'm on, or even our mobile devices, we can very quickly understand our patching process. We can estimate the impact to our organization. Will we be down for an hour? Will we be down for a day? Will I be unable to make a phone call for 10 or 12 minutes? That all changes substantially when we get lower and lower in kind of the internet food chain, if you will, and get to these more fundamental levels where we have inherent risks, inherent vulnerabilities that are present everywhere. But they're much harder to patch. And unfortunately, by nature of the devices, an internet router, switch, or even a DNS server, we can't just walk up and pull the plug on those things or just give a reboot command in the middle of the day, because the scope and scale of an outage, even for what could be a 7-minute reboot, may not be palatable to an organization, may not be palatable to a university or an internet service provider to have that kind of outage. So therefore, we take on two additional dimensions, one of which is the complexity of dealing with some of these vulnerabilities, if we've even been able to identify them. And I think that's probably a conversation for another day, is being able to track things that are built into products that we buy as a box product versus something which we've designed and built on our own. There's additional complexity there. So first, identifying, then dealing with them, dealing with the complexity of the patches, and then even the possibility, if there is one, of being able to deploy such patches. Going further when it comes to hardware and being able to take a sometimes rather sobering view of what pieces may be borrowed from other organizations, getting into intellectual property theft, things of that nature, and dealing with hardware counterfeits. We then have another layer of consideration when it comes to how can we truly attest to what's inside what may be a box product, a router, a switch, a firewall. Of course, there may be open source, and not to demonize open source at all. It's just, I think, a prescient example. But then being able to go further and say, who built this hardware? Who ultimately designed it? Did it come from where it purports itself to be? Is the reseller or distributor reputable and doing the right thing and selling us what appears to be a Cisco product? And so bringing these threads back together when it comes to compliance with an audience such as this, the hope, my hope is to at least spawn some thinking about things that we create and things that we consume, and not looking at things like software bills and materials as a necessary evil, but rather an opportunity when it comes to having a renewed, responsible relationship with technology that we're putting out to market. If we're fortunate enough to have purely a software project, a software product that we bring to market, something that we're contributing to either as an individual team, individual contributor, or part of a broader team, being able to account for what it is we do at an individual level, and not just point in time, but actually being able to track those activities and the things that we're pulling in to the work that we're delivering is absolutely critical. And so I think from a development perspective, I know the last few years, the software that I've designed and developed I've taken on a new appreciation for the complexities of being able to provide assurance, not only to myself and our organization, but to our customers about what is literally in a box. And whether that's something that we're hosting or a product that we're putting in a physical box and shipping to a customer. And so if I accomplish nothing else here today, my hope is to make it so that things like software bills of materials, SBOM, are not viewed as necessary evil. Do take those as an opportunity to be responsible and ethical with what it is we do. I think it's one thing entirely to lose internet service or to be without an online platform or a software or technology tool that we need. It's something entirely to think about potential impact on healthcare and power grid, automobiles, aircraft, things of that nature. Because all of these things and many more do in fact have, because they all have software, they naturally have vulnerabilities and things that can be improved upon. But most importantly, they all have open source components. They all have third-party components, be they open source or commercial, that have been licensed in one form or another and embedded in, and may initially be out of our reach to affect a change on. No one in this room, at least no one that I know of, could reach into a piece of Cisco or Juniper software and affect a change on an inherent vulnerability for a compiled product, that's just there running as an OS image. We could, of course, ask and beg and plead manufacturers to do the right thing, but we still have, as users and developers and integrators of technology, a responsibility to have an understanding of what's inside the box and be able to account for that over time. So I'll pause there. Any questions? Does anyone in the audience have an existing relationship with software bills and materials, or any experience or even agree or disagree when it comes to anything that I've shared so far here today? Okay. As far as working examples here, beyond SolarWinds, has anyone in the audience lived through or dealt with a scenario where a third-party vulnerability has affected any part of your life? Have you, even with something that you've designed or developed, some vulnerability or change to a third-party product affected your development workflow, as a, for example, maybe a more relevant question?
Okay, are you hearing me? Yeah, okay, I think it's working. Anybody have
Yes.
on that from the audience? We have a lot of undergraduates here who may not have had that experience, but may know about some. Would you like us to kind of just brainstorm for a minute and see where those kinds of things take place in society?
I think that would be fantastic. Ultimately, where would a third-party vulnerability maybe affect you directly or indirectly with your experience thus far?
Why don't we pair up and come up with some ideas, and then we'll take some feedback from them.
Great.
We'll give you a minute or two. Okay, so let's go back and who's got some ideas to share? Okay, Nathan.
We're talking about third-party vulnerabilities affecting software. I mean, Log4j, that's pretty much a prime example. Kind of different software, and a lot of things were vulnerable because they had dependency.
I got another one for that. This is one that Nathan was referring to earlier, but it's a separate concept from what's kind of Log4j. That is a supply chain attack. So an example of this would be the left pad incident that happened a few years years ago with NPM, where the developer of a library called LeftPad decided to remove the LeftPad library from NPM, and every library dependent upon it suddenly stopped working, which caused a lot of programs in the end to stop working. And beyond this, there are other types of supply chain attacks as well, like, say, instead of removing the library, you add in open source code. There's actually a supply chain attack recently with the Rust programming language, where it's called typo squatting was applied. So I had a library called Rust Decimal, right? Rust underscore decimal. And that was used in a large number of applications because it's providing the ability to do fixed point arithmetic. And then someone made a library called Rust Decimal without the underscore, and with a name similar to the original developer of the library. And they included code to start snooping around in your Git repository for certain GitHub continuous integration stuff.
That was quite well said. Anybody else? Okay, Noah? I want to get one from CBC. You all have one example? Okay, Marnie, we'll go with you. Go ahead.
There we
And
go.
a little bit of experience in Python. APIs are massive. Low code solutions for highly complex operations such as artificial code. For example, as these low code solutions become more prevalent, that's the buzzword, AWS, some of these web providers, low code solutions. Suppose there would be a vulnerability in one or more of these APIs, you wouldn't even know it. Because you program and also code through abstraction, you're just one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know for certain if this is an actual software vulnerability, but the 2013 target hack, where the hackers tried to remove HVAC systems that had a vulnerability, that directly impacted my life. Thousands of customers. I got this notification from the face and the issue that are on the spot. Lots of lives were affected.
Tina, anybody else? So we're back here. So we'll go back to our speaker. Go ahead.
So some excellent examples, and in each case relevant to the industry, but most importantly, I think relevant to each of us at an individual developer, technology, or end user level. Really a combination. I think if there's a takeaway in all of this, something that we as technologists, from the security perspective, that we often struggle to figure out with all of these whiz-bang machines that we've created, running amazing software, we continue to have struggles establishing trust. And trust is difficult. I think it was Ben Franklin that said that two people can keep a secret if one of them is dead. Not to be morbid, but I think that shines a pretty good light on the humanity's never-ending struggle with trust. And so probably not surprising that from a technology point of view, we've created things that we also have trust issues with. But in each of your examples, there is an element of trust that was broken. In the NPM and Rust software library examples, even recently, some activism to a certain point with an NPM software developer deciding that he was actually going to delete his open source libraries or open source project that had a measurable impact on a number of NPM based as well as containerized workloads on the internet that just naturally reach out to these platforms, pull in new code, and run it. With really trust being extended indirectly from one human to another, because in no uncertain terms, what end users of software packages like that, and really what we all do, anytime we're leveraging open source is we're indirectly extending trust through technology. Through the technology and these examples, the software that's being used, we're extending trust to another human being to say, I hope you don't stab me in the back. And unfortunately, with some of the examples that we have here, that was quite literally what was done. And so I think as you go through your studies, as you decide, what aspects of technology or technologies are most appealing, do understand that and keep in mind that trust is certainly a significant portion of any calculus when it comes to security, be it supply chain security or application and end user facing security. But this topic always brings me back to something that someone who I know and trust from the healthcare world, one of the first high-level CIOs that I ever worked with in the healthcare space, had a saying that anytime he was interviewing anyone for a job in healthcare IT, HIT as it's often called, he would ask them what business they were in or what business they wanted to be in. And if they said anything other than healthcare, he didn't hire them. Because from his perspective, and I think this is something that has served me well, this perspective served me well, his point of view was that healthcare IT is not about the technology, it's not about the bits and bytes or the devices, it's about people. And I think much of what you will envision and develop, no doubt it'll be amazing. But much of what you'll develop is much, much more about people. And what it is you're doing for them and with them, what you're doing for society, whether your impact is at an individual level or community or a global level, it's still very much about people. And so this idea of how do we establish and encode trust into the systems that we build is important. And how do we further, as we put these building blocks together, how is it that we view trust and how is it that we can implement better versions of this to ensure that an open source library that we take for granted and that we absolutely need for our project because it's due on Friday, what if that thing goes away? Have we engendered, put forth too much trust in something over which we have little or no control? In the closing minutes of this, understanding this is maybe outside the scope of what you're focusing on day to day, I wanted to share a recent example actually from just 48 hours ago. Some of the work that we do at Hoplite oftentimes brings together hardware and software in very interesting ways. And we recently had a request from a customer to help them determine whether or not two routers from Cisco Systems, reportedly from Cisco Systems, I'll say, were counterfeit. They had internal reports that two devices were counterfeit. And our, give me one moment here to share this. Our analysis initially from a software perspective yielded some anomalies. We saw some anomalies that didn't necessarily make sense. And let me get my directories back here now that I'm, goodness, here we are. Our software analysis initially led to question the Cisco iOS, the operating system that operates on these devices. Get this open. And so I'm not sure if you have a good view of here, a view of this device. Because we did not get a clear read on these devices through our electronic interrogation, we have some software that reaches into embedded devices like this, pulls out metadata, exercises these devices to try to get a sense for, are these things real or fake? Well, other than a few anomalies, which we couldn't really hang our hats on, the electronic interrogation did not turn up a smoking gun. So we turned to our trusty eyeballs and we actually opened up these devices. And at first I saw something that did not initially appear to be malicious. This device here, so this is actually a pluggable board that holds an SSD chip, a solid state disk chip. You may notice here for the pick and place machines, the machines that build other machines that actually will automatically place a component on here, this little SSD chip, which I have a better annotated version of this, the SSD chip is actually smaller than the sticker, yet we see these tracking markers for the vision system for a pick and place machine, a robot that actually puts surface mount components down onto a new printed circuit board. The tracking markers are much larger. This originally caught my attention because the sticker was hanging over this SSD chip. But because I didn't have a great frame of reference for this, I could not really hang my hat on anything until I went and actually started doing some additional research. Now, this is an actual component directly from Cisco, really contract manufactured for Cisco. And you'll notice that this particular SSD chip from Samsung takes up that whole area. Much smaller. So we looked at this and said, could this be a newer component? Things get smaller and faster. That's Moore's law. We live and breathe that every day. We went back to Cisco. We checked third-party sources and found that this customer, a government customer, had actually been slipped 2 unique modified Cisco routers. As we completed our investigation of this, we found that the distributor did in fact get the initial chassis from Cisco. However, they were apparently intercepted in transit, and the original boards were removed and replaced with modular like-for-like items, functionally identical. The modified versions do everything that the original has, but they actually have shadow SSD. So there is another chunk of SSD storage hidden in these, not present in the original. And so to illuminate some of the challenges that we deal with, not to demoralize, this is the challenge that we live and face, is not just the software that we're creating, the software that we rely upon and use, but actually built into the hardware and being able to account for what is inside a given box, in this case, an internet router. I know we're right at time. Just want to open up for questions and just pass along my thanks for allowing me to spend some time with you today. I hope you got a little something out of this.
Questions for Anthony?
Yeah, what was it with your clients that originally tipped them off that there was something funky going on with these couple routers?
Believe it or not, it was the boxes, the cardboard boxes that held the routers. They did not appear to be genuine Cisco, and due to the nature of this customer's work, they were in tune enough to look at these and say, we're not allowing these devices anywhere close to our network. And so that for us technically was a challenge, because had they said, hey, we plugged this thing in and called home to Beijing, that would have been easy. We can find that, we can action it, we can work to reproduce it. But to say that there were some funny characters on the boxes and they didn't look quite right, was an extra added challenge.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. Did you conduct any research on what kind of attack was being attempted? Because I know the problem with embedded systems hacking and getting persistent access to them is because their hard drive, it's a piece of flash memory, right? You know, so it can change as it goes back to a default state every boot. Was this an attempt to add in persistent access?
Really, that's exactly right. So in this case, this is a moderately advanced technique that we've seen emerge over the last 2 or 3 years. I won't name names to protect the guilty in this case, but the attack actually involves the shadow SSD is there so that the system boots a legitimate version of the Cisco operating system, Cisco iOS, capital iOS, not Apple iOS. So a legitimate copy of the iOS operating system boots, and it reaches a certain point after the image verification is done, because Cisco actually has a lot of security layers to make sure that their devices will only boot a legitimate software image from Cisco. The image reaches a certain boot point at which time the extra intelligence on the extra features, if you will, on the SSD chip kick in and inject a series of instructions into the heap. So into free memory. And the payload, it's called actually, amusingly, an in-service software patch that is injected into the heap, and it exploits some of the nature of Cisco's iOS handling of how it deals with memory. There is a heap watcher that runs in Cisco iOS. And if you are familiar with how that operates, did we lose audio here? Hopefully not. If you're familiar with how that operates, you can actually trick Cisco iOS into executing arbitrary code from the heap. And so all this extra circuitry does is, switch back to speakers here. Sorry about that. What this extra circuitry does, the extra intelligence does, is loads the payload into heap. The last thing that's there that's loaded is a jump instruction. The heap watcher goes through, looks at the heap, gets tricked. That chunk of memory gets turned into an active process that you can only detect in situ, meaning that you actually have to dump memory and compare what was supposed to be loaded versus what's loaded in memory, and do a process by process comparison and process of elimination to identify the malicious process. If you watch the thing boot, and if you're there at an operator console asking it to do router things, it's a router through and through. And so moderately advanced that way. But that's the reason for that shadow piece, is that extra SSD has to be there and have direct access to actually be able to inject code into just a targeted piece of memory. Now, the downside for this is that the attacker has to build this type of attack specifically for each version of Cisco iOS, because if you inject that payload into the wrong memory address, one of two things happens. Either your attack fails or you core the box, and it'll kill itself and probably reboot or shut down. So it's moderately advanced, but not without its challenges as an attacker.
Another question,
Other questions?
Richie?
That sounds like a really sophisticated attack. Was that a case of industrial espionage or was it a state act?
Can you hear us at all? Hello? Let's see. Can you
hear me now?
and we can hear you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Oh.
Put in your earphones. No. Hear me? He can't hear us. When he took his earphones out. Let me see if I can chat. Can I chat on this, Austin? Okay. Actually, right here. So we saw that. Okay.
Okay. I think I have you now.
Okay, good. Yeah. As soon as you took those out, you no longer could hear us.
I apologize for that. I think I am now the victim of an Apple supply chain attack on my my AirPods. So I apologize. I missed the last question from the gentleman that was off on your left.
Yeah, I said it was a really sophisticated attack. Is that a case of industrial espionage or?
I would characterize it as industrial espionage in that you had really a two-prong approach to deliver it. First is that there was the devices were intercepted mid-transit, and the second is that like-for-like components that were specifically crafted for this type of attack did occur. So while the target was almost certainly sensitive information, some of which may have been commercial, I would still characterize this as industrial espionage. If for no other reason, because the know-how to create that like-for-like chip that I showed, that board really required theft of intellectual property first. before anything downstream from that could have been conceived or executed.
Thank you. I have one more question. And I was talking to Glenn Pizzarita, and he said that your company has a way to identify and pinpoint with GPS where the intruder is actually coming from. If they, you know, if they try to hack your system or device, can you tell us anything about how that works and what mechanisms are used, or is it proprietary, or?
Certainly. So there's a combination of information for those in the audience who haven't tackled this topic before. The geographic location of IP addresses, internet addresses, is something that has been an area of interest and research since really the 90s, when the internet, in 93, when the internet was first commercialized. And so the primary mechanism that we use is commercial databases that allow us to see a given IP address and have an idea of not just which internet service provider has been issued that IP, but what organization it's been assigned to. And so portions of that information, as you may guess, like you go to Google Maps or any mapping program, you can type in an address and you'll see a pin, or you'll see a circle saying, hey, your address is somewhere in this area. Being able to actually use natural language processing and things of that nature to be able to look at the text registration of here's the organization street address and so on, can in many cases yield very, very accurate results about exactly what street address a given IP address is at. Now, with that said, we come back to trust. Because, for example, unfortunately, there's no internet police that make sure that every piece of IP address registration that is submitted is accurate. And we have seen a number of examples where bad actors are not dumb. And they have enough savvy and enough knowledge to be able to say, well, I'm going to make my IP address registration falsified, or I'm going to pay someone to falsify it for me. And so in those cases, we use other bits of information, triangulating information by looking at related IP addresses. And this is where we get into some of the proprietary pieces of what we do. We look at related IP addresses, those that are numerically close, and see if we have concurrence of information. We see one IP address that's in Siberia, but another family, a group of related IPs in Moscow. We'll look at that and say, you can almost look at that as a clustering problem in no uncertain terms, and say the one that's reporting itself to be in Siberia is probably the one that's inaccurate. And we, of course, come across those from time to time. We use this type of geo-IP information for security policy, as well as real-time context, for being able to detect situations called magical travel. Meaning that if, let's say, you're in Ashburn, Virginia, and you log into Office 365, and 10 minutes later, you're in Japan, and you log into the same Office 365 account. You can't be in two places at once, and you can't get to Japan from Ashburn, Virginia in that time frame. So one or another is probably not a legitimate connection. That would be an example of where we would use information like that.
You also mentioned honeypots, where you might have a computer that's easily hacked, but I couldn't figure out how you then determine the location based on that.
So looking at the source IP addresses, our honeypot network, we operate about 10,000 sensors, automated honeypots around the internet. And then this makes it so that the honeypots look like vulnerable systems. It could be a vulnerable Windows machine, web server, what have you. And they just sit there and listen. They don't serve any data. They don't run any applications on the internet. And so anyone who is scanning or trying to connect to one of the honeypots is probably up to no good. Or they're a commercial service that's just scanning the internet. And so we sit back and we gather up all this information from the honeypots. We look at the connections, we look at the application traffic. That's all cataloged and analyzed in real time. And what we're able to do is to sit back and over a short period of time, identify whether or not an inbound connection is just garden variety scanning, or if it's something like brute force or an attempt to exploit an application that we're falsely presenting to the internet because they're honeypots. We're able to take that information and the application traffic along with the source IP address and be able to make a pretty accurate determination as to whether or not that activity is malicious. Again, is this an organization like Census or Shodan just scanning the internet because that's what they do for business? Or is this someone trying to break into what they think is a Windows machine? We have software that makes that determination. Anything that crosses a threshold that's suspicious or malicious, they kind of go on to Santa's naughty list, and we're able to use that data in various ways.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony, for joining us today. And you're welcome to stay on and listen to others that we have. But I know you're busy and you made special time today to kind of fit within your schedule and circumstances to be with us. So thank you very much. Let's give them a big round.
Thank you, everyone. Certainly appreciate the time today.
Okay, and you may have some, how do we apply for internships with your company?
You can email us info@hopliteindustries.com. I will make sure that Clem has my contact information as well, but you can also go to hoplite, hoplite.io, and you'll see our contact information there. But info@hopliteindustries.com gets directly to me. And we are always looking for new interns, especially people that want to grow and learn. And even if you like to write software and build networks, you can get your hands dirty this summer and help us bury some fiber.
So yeah, well, there you go.